Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the channel. My name is Caleb Johnston, as always, and today we are going to be discussing a slightly controversial issue. So I've been avoiding it for a bit, but it's been just rattling around in my head. I have to discuss it. Just get it out there, get a few points that I've been thinking about, and that is Misotheism. It is the suspicious uncle of anti-theism, more like a younger cousin or a child of anti-theism, but you'll see what I'm talking about. So, as I said, for an introduction, you guys can see my notes here. This is part of my journey that I had while going through the internet files of atheism, through various channels and various talk shows and etc. And I'm not going to name any names just so that I don't get absolutely cut up by the internet. But long story short, I was watching one particular talk show where they'll have theists or non theists call in and make arguments for or against atheism. And there was one particular time that I watched it. It was actually the first time I watched the show, and the two hosts made it clear that not only were they against theism and against God and against religion, so anti-theists, but even if they knew those things to be true or they found them to be true, they would still reject them. They would still refuse to follow them. That is what Misotheism is. I will define it better in a second. But quick disclaimer, as always, my knowledge is limited here, so forgive me if I keep looking back at my notes to remind myself, and even further, forgive me if I misspeak on a topic or am uninformed from my own error, because I must admit, sometimes I get these things and I put them out onto paper for a video, and at the same time, I'm not as well knowledgeable in it as I should be, as knowledgeable, goodness my grammar, you know what I mean, but as knowledgeable as I should be, and sometimes I will misspeak, not intentionally though, and I do try to correct myself in later videos, so with that being said, and with that disclaimer out there, just take everything I say with a grain of salt and feel free to yell at the screen if I misquote or say something incorrectly. But with that being said, what are the two definitions here for those who do not know? So the first definition, I summarized both of these with the AI unit Claude. You can find it online. I actually think it's a really nice one. I prefer it over ChatGPT. But the first definition is anti-theism. Now, anti-theism is the active opposition to theism and religion. Unlike atheism, which is simply the absence of belief in deities, anti-theism takes a critical stance against religious belief, often viewing religion as harmful to society, progress, or human well-being. Anti-theists typically argue that religious belief should be countered rather than merely disbelieved or tolerated. Now, a quick note that may sound rather similar to mesotheism, excuse me, but typically anti-theism is simply an extenuation on atheism, in the sense that an anti-theist is someone who would likely change their views if they learned they were wrong, or if God were to exist. They would change their views. If they discovered that to be true, they would change it. They would reverse what they've said, and it would no longer be harmful to them. They would philosophically rework their thoughts here. But the problem is, a mesotheist is an extension in the opposite direction. It is anti-theism, but not just anti-theism on the grounds that theism is false and also harmful, but believing that it is true but still harmful and wrong and to be opposed. As Claude very well summarizes, mesotheism is the hatred of God or gods. Unlike atheism, disbelief in deities, or anti-theism, opposition to religion, mesotheism acknowledges the existence of divine beings. I clarified down there the existence or potential existence, so like if then sort of argument. But as I was saying, existence of divine beings, but expresses hostility, hatred, or resentment towards them. It can manifest as a philosophical position that views God as malevolent, unjust, or worthy of opposition, despite believing in God's existence. So, with those two definitions out of the way, why do I find this to be the suspicious uncle of anti-theism, and why do I find it to be, as you could probably see by my notes, unreasonable? Well, let's go into my two reasons for that. These two reasons are just two of the surface level thoughts that I had regarding this, but I think there's a lot more to it that could be said as well. And I do understand that there are a lot of people who would affirm a god, but affirm that their existence is misinterpreted by their followers, and therefore they're actually evil when they say that they're good, or something along those lines. But the point of this is, reason 1. The major gods that are posited by most religions include the concept of perfect goodness in their nature. Objective morality is also affirmed. Furthermore, worship of them and their commandments and teachings are both considered inherently right and good. right or good and or slash and. So if that God or religion is true, if the Misotheist is to say that, oh yeah, well, it's true, but so if they say that is true, then by consequence, those previously mentioned ideals are also true. So those ideas, such as the perfect goodness, objective morality, worship of them being good, commandments and teachings being good, are also true if you were to say that that God or their religion is therefore true. Therefore, the Misotheist is irrational and or incorrect in their hatred, rejection, or judgment, if we are to avoid contradiction here. It seems as though one of the two must be wrong in this case. Now, this makes sense. If you are to say that, let's say, the God of Christianity exists, then therefore the attributes of that God also exist because they are part of that God. One of those attributes in classical theism is perfect goodness. So if that God is true, therefore its attributes are true, or its attributes, if you are to say that those are the same part of that God, you could say that it has different attributes, but that would be a different God. So this has to be the Christian God, for instance, or the Islamic God. You have to pick a God that you are denying or affirming. So if you say the Christian God exists, then the attributes must exist because they are attributes of that God and they are therefore connected to him. And in that case, then your opposition of him is wrong. It is incorrect. If you say that he is evil, but he has perfect goodness, then if you are affirming that God to be true and his attributes therefore to be true, then you must be the one who is wrong in this case, philosophically speaking, to avoid contradiction. I might have spun my words a bit there because I was trying to sort of go off of the notes and finish that point, but hopefully you see what I'm talking about. Unless you are willing to say that, well, that God isn't the one I'm talking about, it's another God that has nothing to do with that particular religion, then fine. But if you are to say that a God of a particular religion exists and you still deny it, then you have to say that you are doing an irrational action. You are saying that something is evil that is good. And that's wrong. That doesn't make any sense. It's the law of contradiction here. Hopefully that makes sense. I know I might have gone off the rails a bit, but hopefully it kept together. The second reason, which follows up behind that and is really more of a practical reason than anything, is that the consequences are worth taking into consideration. Most gods include the concept of eternal punishment or torment for those that reject its teaching. This is not ipso facto a reason to change one's views. But in the case of a mesotheist, it is implied that even if they knew that that was their fate, they would still reject any way to avoid it, at least any way that requires them to not be a mesotheist. I argue that this is impractical and nonsensical, not to mention extreme. It seems that common sense dictates one should take all risks into consideration when embarking on an action, and this is not one to scoff at. So this really is something to take into consideration. If, and I know I've said that same sentence like a billion times, but really it is. If you are to say that this God is real, that hell is real, that this religion is correct, but you are going to reject it anyway based on your own personal philosophical judgments and groundings, which you have necessarily by the law of contradiction refuted if you are to accept that religion or God to be true or say that it is true, then by that consequence, you are also saying that you are going to reject any possible way to avoid the worst fate possibly known, eternal torment and punishment. Now, as I said, these two arguments together only really work against somebody who is truly accepting a God of a particular religion. If you want to go and say that there is this God that does not have eternal punishment, is not perfectly good, and does not affirm objective morality, but they exist and they demand us to worship them, but there are not those extra elements on the side, then fine, it makes perfect sense. You could argue that it is not a perfectly good God, or that objective morality is not correct and the God is lying, or that worship of them and their commandments and teachings are all wrong. And but they still exist and they demand you to worship them, but they're not going to punish you for it. You could kind of twist it to make it into a different God. But if you are to affirm a particular God of a particular religion is true, and yet to say you still reject the essential tenets of it, it is no longer that God. So Misotheism really doesn't apply. It really isn't consistent when it comes to the main forms of gods. However, if you want to, pick apart the god and its attributes, then you could probably make a good argument against it in that case. But when it comes to saying, oh, well, the Christian God is true, but I think he is evil, or I know that I will go to hell for rejecting him, but I'm going to do it anyway, both of those are just inherently irrational. One, because God is perfectly good in the Christian sense, and that means that you would be wrong for saying he is evil, and going to hell because you rejected it is a terrible fate, and I think anybody would have to sit there and really work their gears to say, yes, I know I will go to hell for rejecting what is true, and yet I am not going to reject it because Misotheism. It just seems nonsensical to me. As I said, I probably didn't get at the heart of the argument here, but I thought it was worth mentioning these 2 points. I find Misotheism in particular to be a strange version of anti-theism, and in particular, a version of anti-theism that really isn't intellectually honest in the same way that subjectivism is not necessarily that honest, in my opinion, but we'll go into that in another video. With that being said, I hope I didn't anger anybody too much. I wanted to keep this as charitable as possible, but I think it's something that is becoming a trend in more new atheist groups, and it needs to be addressed. At least some good counter arguments would be nice, outside of, well, I just don't like this God, so therefore I reject him. It would be nice to see something that's a stronger point. And remember, I am an agnostic, so this is coming from a guy who somewhat agrees with some sentiments of anti-theism, but mesotheism is just one step too far, in my humble opinion. But with that being said, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day and enjoy.